Thank you, Jeff, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all today. I'll talk about this challenge in the context of the work that we do at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. At present, I think that we are amidst a collapse in the faith and trust in expertise by people throughout the world. They wish for expertise to be devoted to the analysis of the public good, and yet they are suspicious that what they are experiencing is merely marketing for the wealthy and the powerful. One can learn a lot by reading one of the most famous children's books of all time, The Little Prince, where over and over it is demonstrated by the author Antoine Saint-Exupéry that children somehow are able to see much more clearly than their adult counterparts. We live in a time, and I'll date it to 1971, when a man named Lewis Powell wrote a memo in the United States on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, where we've seen a tremendous growth in what I will call a hero system that created meaning for the life of people because they became financially wealthy, because they became wizards of technology who could expand the potential for all of our future, almost acting as though they were gods. And in the realm of philanthropy, whatever their donation, however politically slanted, whatever taboos they abided, they were considered to be generous. That hero system, which was guidance to many people about how to create a meaningful life, even a meaningful life beyond their physical existence, is in tatters. In addition to work to provide technical wizardry, people are now terrified of centralization of control, of taboos enforced in philanthropy in much needed areas, of policies which manipulate governance to exacerbate inequality and to make it possible not to pay taxes. What used to be called tax evasion is now merely tax avoidance because of the lobbying of the powerful. To overcome that resistance, and this is where I think the work is now important, the first thing we need is a vision, the vision of what to do. Joseph Stiglitz, in this last half hour, provided an extraordinary constellation of visions to remedy many, many of the maladies that society now suffers from. Other people who I've worked with, including Jeffrey Sachs, Martin Guzman, George Akerlof, Michael Spence, James Heckman, these are people who have achieved great things in their life, great awards, title, and affirmation, and yet they have the courage to take the risk to provide a vision of the way forward and not simply affirm the direction that power has taken us into. After 50 years from the time of the Powell memo, there are tremendous distortions and fault lines that have been revealed from a paradigm that said the market is a god, it is a deity, not just a tool, and government is always the problem. Though I must say, at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, what we often say among my staff that we're fighting two failed romances. One is the deification of market, and one is the romance that government will always do the right thing if given the chance. We are at INET in trying to change this, what I will call remove the resistances to paradigm evolution. We are currently studying the control of the economics profession and the incentives they face, research assessment exercises, and peer-reviewed journals which constrict the issue space that's involved and what James Heckman calls facilitates a crony impact factor, narrowing the scope of who will be supported, funded, given tenure to a very narrow circle of people who are protecting their brand name for not tangling with power. The resistances are being, overcome at somewhat organically by the clear recognition of the danger of climate, the clear recognition of a failure of social sustainability, and the rebellions that ensue. At INET, we have different strategies related to different segments of society. The first, which I think is probably our most important mission of the next 5 years, is to fundamentally change the textbooks, particularly the textbooks which you might call Economics 101, or the beginning, where you are not really focused on training future economists who will be the leaders and visionaries. You're focused on training the general public on what do these institutions mean, and what do they provide, and do they have faults or failings that have to be protected against. I must note that in our work with the Scholas Operantes group and Pope Francis, that they have convinced me that there is a very strong need also for something that is prior to the college textbook, which we might call the economics civics, that is taught to people from age 15 to 18. And that is very essential, at least in part because most people, over 80% of people, do not attend college that live on planet Earth, and they are all responsible in some small way for governance and awareness and constructive resistance and rebellion to abuse. I come back to then the next dimension, which is to train the future leaders. I have always said that the mission of INET, which is now 10 years old, is a 30-year mission or longer. And the most important thing regarding changing the leadership of the economics community or the social science multidisciplinary community is to develop a community to nurture and train the teachers 20 and 30 years from now. What we call our Young Scholars Initiative, which now has more than 10,000 active members and is working to expand even further in various places in Asia and Latin America, Eastern Europe and the like, is an important place for people to gain strength through community, through supporting each other in curious investigation and not submitting to what we might call the tyranny of the journals or the indoctrination of the textbooks. We are fortunate, I think all of mankind, with the advent of technology which permits more evidence-based analysis, though I'm cautious, and I would cite the behavioral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who Haidt is how he pronounces it, H-A-I-D-T, where he says you have to be careful because people will always find evidence to support what they want to believe. I've mentioned this question of the resistance to change, and I think it's also important to have a much deeper vision of psychology of the human being, their desires, their fears, and their aspirations. The famous poet Muriel Rukeyser once wrote a book called The Life of Poetry. And the life of poetry begins with a section called The Resistances. She describes when she was in Norway and the Germans began bombing the country during the Second World War, that she got aboard a ship to evacuate with many local people and head to New York. And on the way, she thought she would cheer them up by reading them poetry. And as she read them her poetry, they reacted very negatively. And in this book on the life of poetry, she talks about the fear of poetry, poetry to stir up your spirit, to help you to evolve at a time when you're afraid. You put on your armor and you do not experience any, what you might call pleasure or excitement from that stimulus. There's another gentleman who writes about resistance and fear, much more germane to our social science context. His name was Stephen Toulmin, famous philosopher from Cambridge, England. Toulmin he wrote a book called Cosmopolis, which is about the hidden history of modernity. And he spoke about how from the 30 Years' War to the 1980s, you see a repeated pattern, which is every time what we might call the fault lines of enlightened Cartesian social organization became evident, you would approach a crisis, and people, visionaries, people like Joseph Stiglitz, would see beyond, but people would lurch back to the familiar rather than forward to evolve in that period of fear. I think we have a lot of work to do right now, because I sense crisis in many, many dimensions. Joe articulated many of them, that we have to move forward. But none is more important than creating a more powerful vision of what is constructive in a life plan amidst a failed hero system, a deeper psychology of what it means to be a leader, what it means to be an expert, what the value of financial wealth entails. These people, if you and I in this room, we are obviously concerned about the poor, we are concerned about survival, but we also have to acknowledge that wealthy people are humans too, and their human characteristics and their human resistance is essential to studying how to unlock this next challenge. They cannot be demonized, or it will be to our own detriment. I was recently at the World Economic Forum and had the experience over several days of seeing a peer group of elite and wealthy people acknowledge together that climate change was dangerous and the challenge was upon us. But I heard no one at any of the private dinners talking about how our paradigm of the last 50 years and its fault lines called for a change of action, in particular a reinvigoration of governance, perhaps a reduction in the role of money in politics, a role of wealthy or the big corporations in the nature of governance. But the challenge of the resurrection of public expertise and faith in governance is also very formidable. But I challenged many of the people that I talked with privately, or at a couple of dinners where I spoke at the World Economic Forum, that it is now time not to be comforted by your peers and yourself agreeing to what goodness is, but to experience and take on the discomfort and perhaps the opposition from what used to be your peer group by engaging courageously in meeting the challenge of climate change and changing the nature of governance. I am here today primarily because when I look at the things that I want to affirm in life, I saw Pope Francis stand out. I saw him challenge convention. His encyclical Laudato Si focused on climate and focused on the care for each other. This is a profound statement. It's a beacon. It's something that our young people who, like the Little Prince, can react to positively. And it's something that I want to help reinforce with all of you to push us beyond the resistance to the next stage of society. Thank you.